So I'm going to talk about the platform a little bit here, and I wanted to start off with a little bit of a throwback, a little bit of a history lesson. This was a paper that Mark Burgess and Alva Couch wrote for Lisa back in 2006, and it's at the time in 2006, there was beginning to be such a proliferation of config management tools that these two extremely smart college professors designed an algorithm, a set of heuristics for determining how good or bad a given configuration management tool was. So they had to come up with this elaborate formulae for ranking and categorizing the different tools because there was such a proliferation of them. But there were a few amusing things from this paper that I wanted to point out. The first one is the line right in the introduction here that the configuration management tools, for whatever reason, seem to engender in their adherents a faithful adherents whose dedication to the approach borders on religious fervor. If any of you have engaged on Hacker News threads or Reddit around this recently, I would have said Slashdot if this was 10 years ago, but this may seem familiar to you. And the other question that they wondered about was, why does it seem so necessary to reinvent the wheel, and why is everybody making their own new configuration tool? They, in a footnote, included this little tidbit that they took a poll at the Config Management Birds of a Feather session at Lisa 2003, where almost everybody had written their own tool, and nearly nobody had used anybody else's tool at the time. This was incidentally, the Lisa 2003 was the first time that I met Luke Knies face-to-face at this configuration management BOF. I also, I think, jumped up out of my seat and yelled at Mark Burgess that he ruined my life. And he also saved my life, so I told him both sides of it. Somewhat coincidentally, it was held at the same San Diego Town and Country where last year's PuppetConf was. So going back last year was like coming home in a very weird way. It was cool. Fast forward a few years, and this was the first Puppet camp back in 2009 at the UCSF campus. And there are a few familiar faces, or at least the backs of their heads. Gary Larizza took this photo, and as you can see, there's Luke up on stage, Lydia, James Turnbull, there's Ludicourt, who's still here, Nigel, Ari Pinar, Nazrat, and me. I was still bald back then. There's Ben Hughes with his pink hair, obviously. But the point is not so much to exhume the ancient past, but to say that there's a lot of the ideas that were formed back, in this 2006, 2009 era that are still with us today. The folks are still around. I think I still have a quote from Pris Nazrat in the source code of one of the Puppet manifests that I still use. It was a quote that they made about the preponderance of technical debt and how, sure, you could do it this way, but it's going to accumulate a tax, and you're going to have to pay it off sooner or later. And I still try to keep that in mind when I'm writing Puppet code and keep things as simple as humanly possible. But at this time, the user community was growing tremendously. People latched on to Puppet's approach. Modules started to emerge that provided some elements of reusability, so it wasn't that everybody had to write a manifest from scratch every time they wanted to solve a particular problem with Puppet. And Puppet had really found its viral loop. This is a much maligned phrase amongst the startup community, but in Puppet's viral loop, it's like, your goal as a product designer or whatever is to find out whatever it is that people will use your product. They'll get a little bit of joy or enjoyment out of it. They'll tell other people that they know, and then they'll repeat the cycle in enabling some kind of huge rapid growth pattern. Puppet's viral loop was really about discovering that you could stop doing things on your own, stop doing things your own way, stop writing scripts, and instead get some reusability. And then once you got one of those things working, it just felt so amazing. And I'm sure this is still something that you've experienced today if you've spent a lot of time working on a really obnoxious, problem in a module and wonder why it doesn't work. Oh yeah, I forgot about this. Get it going, and all of a sudden this thing that had either paged you out of bed in the middle of the night or had been just a giant pain in the butt, it was spamming the logs with error messages. It's now gone. A burden is lifted from your shoulders, and you can proceed to the next awful thing. But the viral loop was really in effect in this time, and the Puppet's community growth was just exploding, and it was really, really awesome to behold. I'm going to trace a little bit of a timeline from where we were then until where we are today, and then a little bit about where we're headed in the future. And I don't want to necessarily read every one of these things, but just to set a little bit of context, in Puppet 0.25, which came out in 2009, we had just changed over from using XML-RPC to using REST for all the network calls, and that was overall a good thing. It was much faster, and most importantly, it wasn't XML-RPC, so that was good. We added the ability to do, if you had a nodes.pp with all your nodes in it, you could, instead of having to list out every single node by its node name, you could use a regular expression to match a bunch of nodes all into one stanza. It's pretty revolutionary at the time, because previously things were awful. We had this idea of stored configs, which was a way to keep your exported resources and keep your catalogs out. And Brice Figaro came up with a way to make it so that it didn't destroy your Puppet master every time a new agent checked in. So thanks, Brice, for that. We had just added the idea of parameterized classes. So before this, actually this might have been a 2.6 thing that I jumped ahead a little bit, but parameterized classes were available that previous to that, there was no way to influence a module's behavior programmatically or a class's behavior programmatically. You had to set a global scope variable and then guess at it inside of the module or something. Things were not good. Moving up to 2.7, we added the automatic parameter lookup, and stored configs evolved into PuppetDB. There were a couple of backwards incompatible point releases. Anybody else share scar tissue from when 2.7 changed what class names were valid in the middle of the release stream? Yeah, I know Trevor does. That was not good. Puppet Enterprise came out this time. There was Puppet Enterprise 1.0, which is kind of a neat thing. And we added the ability to run Puppet device, so you could connect to systems sort of and use the Puppet agent in sort of a proxy mode and connect to a remote device. And again, thanks to Brice for that. That was also a pretty significant patch set that he incorporated into the Puppet code base. In Puppet 3, which is the first, that was the first Puppet release when I was actually an employee. I worked on this one. We had XLOOKUP in the old days where you could sort of do a similar thing to what Hira did, but each of the values had to be a comma-separated list, so that wasn't great. And Hira moved it to YAML, which is a lot better. We also, as a consequence of those backwards incompatible point releases, hewed to a fairly strict semantic versioning for Puppet versions. And Mike Stonke in the back and I have probably lost more hours debating with each other about what version number a thing should be than we have about arguing about literally any other subject, including whether Dre or Nate Dogg was the most superior 90s hip-hop rapper. It was about this time that that we had the first Puppet Conf in 2011, so a little bit before Puppet 3. It was up in Portland, and I was living in the Bay Area, down in the South Bay here, and I went to Portland for the first time and went to Powell's for the first time, and I got lost in the rare book room in Powell's for like an hour and a half. They had this first edition William Burroughs book signed by Burroughs, and I kind of fell in love with the city. I was like, God, this is kind of amazing. Here's a place where I feel like I could be myself. I could breathe. My first question that people asked me wasn't about where I worked or, like what my stock options were. They actually cared about me as people. It was kind of a welcome change from the Bay Area. So I moved up there to go work for Puppet, and it's been a pretty awesome ride. Working at the company at the time was pretty amazing. There was about 70 people when I started, and we're about 560 now. So that's been a pretty wild ride. The Puppet 3 series lasted for quite a while. There was a couple of years of Puppet 3 releases, and they were some were oriented. And what we tried to do was to release new things as feature flags so that you could sort of opt into behaviors. The biggest one of these is the future parser, which is now, since it's the future, we just call it the parser. It's like, what they call Canadian bacon in Canada? Bacon. But the future parser was kind of the first big evolution of the Puppet language that had come about. It was up until that point, we were still running kind of the Ruby parser that I think Luke had written most of it in a hotel room while he was doing a contract at Stanford. And so there was, some weird things that it did that ended up over time, because so many people got used to the way that parser behaved, they just ended up being the way it worked. And some of those were good things, and some of those were not so good. If you've ever written code that looked like, to test whether something is true, you tested whether it was not there, whether it was a thing called undef, where it was a string called undef, whether it was false or the word false, and any of those meant that it was false. You probably appreciated the fact that we could now have much more assertive sense of what truth is and what reality is and where even am I than we did with the previous parser. But it came with it. Brought along with it a set of incompatibilities and changes in behavior. So it took quite a while for the bugs to get worked out and for us to make it actually the current parser as it is in Puppet 4. Puppet Server came about this time, and again, this was a sort of a response to people running Puppet at scale and having trouble really scaling out to big infrastructures with the server stack as it was. At the time, you had to pretty much run Puppet under Apache and use Passenger to... was anybody still using Passenger? Can I ask this question? I do occasionally... Is that Joe? Hi. Oh, you know people still using it. You aren't yourself using it. Okay, that's a different question. That's actually quite encouraging. I think a year ago, it would have been a pretty different proportion, but that's cool to see that people have moved on to Puppet Server. Puppet Server is pretty awesome. It's just sort of opened up another 0, and in some cases 2 zeros in the number of agents that a single master can support. But again, came not without a set of difficulties being born and getting out into the world. One of the really awesome things that I've been very gratified to see come to fruition and get a lot of widespread adoption across the community is this idea of policy-based auto-signing for certificates. It used to be that your choices for new certificates were to sign each one manually, or to put a host name or a set of host names or just a star into your autosign.conf so that any certificate that came in would get automatically signed, which is not the best security model in the world, you might say. Policy-based auto-signing lets you write a really simple script that gets passed a request when a new agent comes up and requests a certificate, and you can do things like poll your EC2 or your vSphere API and tell whether that certificate, which can have a key embedded in it or pre-shared key or whatever, whether that ought to be signed, and make some more intelligent policy-based decisions about the certificate signing. So that's been pretty cool to see happen. And I think the most widely used policy-based auto-signer was originally written by one of the SREs at Puppet, Daniel Dreyer, and you can probably find that on GitHub if you look for policy auto-signer. It's awesome, and it works really well. We'll talk to a variety of virtualization and cloud APIs to make those signing decisions. So it really closes a loop in the certificate policy or in the certificate lifecycle. A big focus at this time, too, was Windows performance and functionality. I mean, Puppet sort of came out of the Linux and Unix world and was, a Linux first for a long time. And Josh Cooper and Ethan and Rob Reynolds, who now started a company around Chocolatey, and others at Puppet and also in the wider community, really worked hard in this time frame to enhance Windows functionality for Puppet, make sure that Windows, that not did it just work, but that it felt right. It felt, if you were coming to Puppet from a Windows background rather than coming to Windows from a Puppet background, that things worked the way that you expected them to, and you had a good experience. And that's something that we've actually picked back up recently and are pushing forward on that again after maybe leaving it dormant for a little too long. A little later in the 3.7 series, we started moving out of YAML as a serialization format and onto our own wacky version of JSON. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But it turns out that if you use Ruby and you serialize YAML, you can sometimes unserialize things that you didn't intend to, including ways to execute arbitrary code and instantiate new objects on the master and all kinds of bad stuff. So we started moving away from YAML completely. Those specific bugs have been long fixed, by the way. But just as a general principle, the idea that you can load stuff out into memory and get new objects in the runtime of the master is not great. Factor 3 came out about this time. Factor got rewritten in C++ and now runs in something like 100th of the time that it used to, although we still maintain compatibility for Ruby-based custom facts and external facts. And Brees, yet again, came up with a really awesome port of the authentication system that does URL validation from agent to master communication, and wrote that into the closure service, so we can move off of just purely a certificate-based whitelist and onto much more sophisticated rules that provide the same level of functionality you get from the previous auth.conf in Puppet. In Puppet 4, we sort of changed the packaging strategy and made it so that there was an all-in-one agent instead of having a bunch of different packages. This allowed us to include a consistent version of Ruby across all the versions of the operating system that we delivered for, which is really awesome. Thanks for you can give Mike applause for that. That was kind of awesome. And yeah, when we had to work with Ruby 1.8.5 because RHEL 5 was still a thing, 1.8.7, 1.9, it was just a huge constellation of stuff, and the level of monkey patching that we had to do into the core of Ruby to make it work across those versions was not great. So that was pretty cool. The network URLs, this is a change that happened kind of under the hood, but it also had some user-visible implications because all of a sudden, Puppet 3 agents and Puppet 4 masters were talking different URLs over the wire. So there's a compatibility layer that rewrites the Puppet 3 agent URLs into the way Puppet 4 expects. And the Puppet 4 URLs are objectively better. If you look, if you're an esthetician of URLs, or if you care a lot about API design, the fact that each of the URLs in the Puppet 3 era agents had an unknowable and unguessable path, the environment, as the first element of the URL, and then all the stuff that you actually cared about was after that, was not, it caused some problems. So the new one's much more, it's easy to route if you're using caching servers like Varnish in front of your Puppet masters, or you're using hardware-based load balancers. The Puppet 4 URLs shrank down the rewrite rules or the content switching rules that I used for directing Puppet agents to different masters from 30 lines down to 3. It was much better. And then through the lifetime of Puppet 4, we started prepping again for the next major version for Puppet 5, which we'll talk about in a moment. And we got a pretty substantial update to Hyra, which is just a slight step behind the one that we're shipping today in Puppet 5. And this allowed us to do things like have a hierarchy inside of your environment. which was not possible with the previous version of Hira. You can now also use the awesome lookup function in your manifests and the Puppet lookup command line utility to get an explanation of why you got a particular value for a Hira key, which again was really, really difficult to do in the previous Hira backend, and means that if you have a big team and you have somebody who is kind of the Hira architect, and you have other people that are just trying to live in that first person's world and they don't quite understand it, that can be really difficult. It can be really hard to figure out why this host got this value for this particular key. And Puppet Lookup Explain is like a giant chainsaw that just cuts through all of that complexity and makes it really easy to understand. I say sort of here because it was Hira 4 had a very quick turn, a very short lifetime, and quickly turned into Hira 5, which I'll talk about now. So now we released Puppet 5.2 just last month, and some of the things I'll do another show of hands. I don't generally like this, but people look like you're falling asleep, so I'm gonna make you stand up in a minute too. But some jumping jacks or something, get the blood flowing. No, but how many folks are running Puppet 5, some version of Puppet 5 right now? Awesome. So just for the record, that's about 15, 20% of the room. How many of you are running Puppet 4? So Puppet 4 variant, this includes all Puppet Enterprise that have a year in it. It's like 80%. How many of you are running Puppet 3? Okay, that's more than 100%, so that was like 15%. Okay, how many are still running Puppet 2 anywhere in production? Nobody. How many? Yes, well done. Well done for all of us. We should all pat ourselves on the back. Anyone still running Puppet anything, 0.25? There was one large university that I talked to just last year that was still running 0.25 in production, and we had a long talk and help them process their pain, and it's better now. So Puppet 5 came out, 5.0 came out in July, and we've done a couple of point releases since then. The main thing about it is that we have moved all the network communications from this random PSON thing to JSON, which means it's way faster. We can now use these native JSON libraries both on the server side as well as built into MRI. And the performance numbers that we got out of the perf team when we first got this implemented end-to-end were dramatically better, so much so that I didn't believe them. I asked for Doug Rosser, who's our main performance engineer at Puppet, to go back and actually rerun all the tests, because it was like, there's no way that you're actually getting like 5x the number of clients before you see a performance spike. There's no way you're actually getting like compilation times of less than 20% what we were previously, but those are about what the numbers were. I have a more I don't recall them exactly, so I'm a little bit reluctant to quote exact numbers for the camera and for posterity, but I did write a blog post where I used the actual numbers that we got. But yeah, it's pretty awesome. Hira 5 is now baked into Puppet, and Hira 5 is awesome. If you're into Hira, and who among us isn't, Hira 5 presents a real step function and functionality. The two things that I would say are big takeaways for Hira 5 are, number one, data in modules. You can now have Hira data that lives inside of your module, whose namespace is restricted to the module's namespace, so you can't just inject arbitrary keys that influence behavior of other stuff, but that if you have like a really complicated params.pp or some other thing that does conditional logic to figure out what the right value is, if you've used Hira for a little while, you're like, this looks exactly like a Hira problem that I have to do with this really nasty mess of conditionals. Why can't I just have Hira inside of my module? Well, now you can. And I want to give a special shout out too to Ari Pinar, who did an implementation of data in modules as kind of like a proof of concept originally, and then poked at me nonstop for about 9 months until we figured out a way to productize that and make that the real thing. So I'm super, super excited about the implementation as it is now, as well as the functionality. And there's really great docs that just got a redo over the last few weeks about Hira 5. So check that out. And data module is awesome. The second thing is data in environments. So again, you can have environment level data, and your hierarchy can be different per environment. And there's just a level of sophistication that you can do inside of the Hira 5 environment Hira.yaml that is a response to all the things that people tried to do with the classic Hira, as we call it now, that just didn't work. So for instance, instead of having to have, if you have some YAML, some encrypted keys, instead of having to have a whole separate YAML backend that gets scanned and then your regular one gets scanned, you can say that one or two levels are where your YAML lookups ought to happen, and EM will only be consulted when we're looking up keys on that level. So performance boost and just a cleanliness boost. You don't have this kind of really messy mental model that you have to build in your head of how your Hira works in order to understand it. Another big change is the way that the packages are distributed. They're still on one packages. They're versioned consistently, so they're all 5 dot something. So PuppetDB, the Puppet server and Puppet agent are all 5 dot whatever, and the version of the platform overall, which comprises those packages, is just sort of revved as each monthly release comes out. They're stored in a repository that's just called Puppet. That Puppet is actually on the repository server is actually a symlink. So if you want to stay with Puppet 5 throughout its lifetime, you can install a repository package that's Puppet 5, and you'll keep within that major version the whole time. If you want to stay current across major versions, and you, as you probably should be if you run any sizable estate, run your own repository mirrors off of our upstream mirrors, you'll see those, if you stay with just the Puppet repos, when there is a Puppet 6, we'll change that symlink, and Puppet will start getting Puppet 6 packages. But the Puppet 5 repo will remain preserved in Amber, and it won't get updates after its EOL, but you won't get breaking change onto your systems if you're installing directly from it either. And again, thanks, Trevor, for the feedback. As we were working through that proposal, there was a number of implications and consequences of that I think we ended up in a pretty good balance of trying to keep people current, keep things going, but not breaking the world unnecessarily. Speaking of which, I will also mention that Puppet 3.x agents are also compatible to Puppet 5 servers. I mentioned that URL rewriting. If you have any Puppet 3 stuff, it will still continue to work as it should, talking to Puppet 5 masters. Additionally, and perhaps most importantly, no Puppet module code which works for Puppet 4 needs to change for Puppet 5. So if you, and again, we went through, this was sort of a learning experience. I think there were a couple of changes for the Puppet 4 language that had bigger implications than we realized, and it took a lot of people a lot of time to get their code updated. The changes were for the good. I don't think, I wouldn't, if I had a time capsule, go back and undo them, but I probably would have made it, some things that were hard failures, a little softer failures, and make it a little easier to get upgraded. But one thing that we learned is that it's really, really difficult to get large code bases updated on any kind of reasonable time scale. And so you've got to either provide a ramp, or you've got to provide compatibility, or ideally only break compatibility if there's a really, really, really good reason for it in Puppet code. New thing, and that's a little bit of a diversion, but new thing in Puppet 5.2 is that we now have support for intermediate certificate authorities. We kind of had this a little bit, sort of, but you had to do a lot of hacking around to get it to work. The main use case for this that I've heard from folks is if you have, a lot of people have a company-wide certificate authority, usually if you have Active Directory, and you have like you have a policy that all of your certificates have to chain to that corporate root CA. And previously, your only options in Puppet were to try to bargain with your security team. That generally doesn't work out too well, or give up and disable the Puppet CA completely and just use the external certificate issuer as your one source of truth there. Well, with Puppet 5.2, we now have the ability to do both leaf node checking on the agents, so you can have the certs issued off an intermediate CA, plus the certificate authority that runs in the Puppet server understands that it does not have to be the ultimate root authority, that it can have a chain of trust, and that it knows that it can issue off of the cert that it has, and so you can get your security team to issue you a signing CA and use that signing CA on your Puppet master to assign all your agents. So and a shout out there to Adrian Thibault, aka Finch, who did most of the heavy lifting there and knows things about SSL that most mortals are not meant to know, and somehow managed to retain most of his sanity through that. Some other new stuff that's kind of adjacent to Puppet 5.2, but not directly in Puppet 5.2. How many of you heard about Puppet tasks this morning? Hopefully all of you. How many of you have tried them out so far? Downloaded Bolt and tried it out, or have poked around in Puppet tasks? A few? Awesome. I'm pretty excited about this. I'm less excited now than I was 6 hours ago just because I haven't slept, but I'm still pretty jazzed about it, and it's going to be pretty awesome. The connections in between tasks and Puppet are, right now we're kind of trying to make it so that Bolt on its own and tasks in general can iterate as quickly as they need to in response to feedback and people actually using it out in the world. But over time, I would expect those integrations to get a little bit closer. Right now, for instance, there is a vendored version of the Puppet code base that lives inside the Bolt gem, which is how the task plans work and how the languagey bits, like the searching through the module path and the namespacing and those kinds of things work inside of Bolt. And that's less than optimal, but it does mean that we can make changes to that Bolt-specific Puppet without requiring new Puppet agent releases, which is way more expensive and would slow everything down. So those are the kinds of trade-offs that over time we want to converge and make it a little less awful. Probably that will mean extracting the parts of the language out into their own repository or their own independently distributable artifact, whether that's a gem or whatnot, so that they can be included in the Puppet agent itself or in Bolt or in anything else that wants to implement the Puppet language. Puppet Development Kit. Again, sorry, one more show of hands. How many have used the Puppet Development Kit so far for your modules? How many are aware of its existence but have not yet used it? So that's almost everybody. Why not? It's so cool. It means that you don't have to write a bunch of boilerplate anymore. The development kit's really awesome. And for me, the best thing about this is that one of my favorite Puppet tools, Puppet Lint, which Tim Sharp wrote several years ago, and which got kind of dusty on the edges, has gotten so much love lately. It's gotten so many updates. A bunch of the linting rules are now really consistent with the best practices and with the current Puppet style guide, and it's really easy to get new linter rules contributed and built into it, and everybody should be linting your code all the time, like it's the best. It can fix your Puppet 4 incompatibilities automatically. It's amazing. If you have code, well, not all of them, there's an asterisk, there's like caveats, caveat emptor, et cetera, but if you have like the 5 most common things that block people from being able to use, to get their Puppet 3 code updated and start using Puppet 4 constructs like the type system, it'll just find and fix those. Hey, you have unquoted file modes. We need to put quotes around them. Boom, you're done. Yeah, so Puppet Lint's awesome, and the rest of the stuff that's in the development kit is also coming along really fast, and it's really cool. And it supports tasks as of today. And the last thing is the resource API is a new API to replace or to, I guess augment, stand alongside. It's not going to replace it. I don't mean to imply that we're going to get rid of the existing type and provider system. That's not what we're doing. But we do have a new API which allows you to build types and providers in a way that doesn't involve exposing yourself to the Necronomicon and the eldritch horrors contained within. You can just write a data file that has what your type looks like and then write a provider that does that stuff with getters and setters. It's like a sane, awesome API that David Schmidt is the primary author of. It's an open source repo that will be released as a gem initially and then ultimately get folded into the Puppet code base once it stabilizes. But if you've written types and providers, I highly recommend checking it out. There's a talk specifically about this that I have to look up, but it's got resource API in the name of the talk, so you can find it on the schedule. But if you're a module author that writes or hacks on types and providers, this is going to make your life a lot better. If you look at the proof of concept one is for the apt, is inside the apt module. And if you look at the old one and the new one side by side, the old one you're like, what the hell is this thing doing? And the new one you're like, oh, okay. So check it out. But that's not what you came here for, probably. You came here for a roadmap. And fortunately, I ride my bike a lot in the hills around Portland, where I now live. This is one of my favorite detours when I ride into work. It goes through a cemetery in the West Hills, and it's oddly peaceful. I don't know. I don't really have anything against dead people, and they don't mess with you very much when you're riding your bike in their midst. And it has a gorgeous view, and so I like to go up there when I have a little time before meetings start in the morning and punish my legs and my lungs and get my head on straight. And there's lots of nice roads up there, so it's a good road map. So you may be wondering, like, where are we going? What's coming up down the road? Are we going to have to rewrite our modules again? And I hope you now agree that the answer is no. You will not have to rewrite your modules again. I just want to hit a couple of points really quick here. This is not going to be like a super detailed roadmap slide, but just sort of broad themes about where we're headed. The first one is remote first. So Puppet historically is treated, as Omri talked about this morning, resource abstractions as being primarily about operating system primitives. And in order for Puppet to adapt to today's world, we have to evolve our understanding of what a resource is to think about remote resources first. And by remote, I just mean we're manipulating a resource that does not live on the same system as the thing that's doing the manipulating. So we can't rely necessarily on POSIX calls or running execing programs in order to retrieve the state of that resource and to compare it against desired state and then remediate it. We have to think about things in a remote first kind of way. Calling back to the slide about Puppet Device. Puppet Device was a first cut at trying to do this. We're working on how to evolve Puppet Device. It also has gotten pretty dusty over the years and needs some attention and love. But I think that model is actually pretty strong of being able to use an agent that has a catalog and the catalog has a isomorphic relationship to the resources that we want to manage on the endpoint that we care about. That is, there's a one-to-one relationship between what that catalog contains and the resources that we care about for that particular system or endpoint or whatever it is. But that there's a transport layer that allows you to operate on those resources at arm's length, so we're not expecting them to be local. That kind of work, along with tasks, is going to become much more important. It already is important, and we're trying to enhance and develop that work. The way I think about this is, in writ large, is that there's kind of this continuum between, on the one hand, imperative automation that we do, which is squarely in the camp of Bolt and the Puppet task framework that I talked about this morning, and on the far other end of it, around state-based management, which is kind of Puppet's traditional bread and butter. But in between those two endpoints, there's a continuum of use cases and problems that people have that we need to find solutions for. And some of them overlap. It's not like, in some cases, there's not a clear cutting off point between like what I did this morning, I managed a package. I updated the package. I did it with a task, but I could also have written Puppet code that included made a catalog that set the package insured to a particular value and update it that way. What's the right way? Well, it really depends on what the problem is in front of me. And as I talked about this morning, like I could have done all that with a code, but if somebody's breathing down my neck or I have a production down kind of problem, I need a tool that's going to fix those problems right now, and I'll catch the state of the state enforcement up later on. Puppet Device fits in there. A remote RAL, which I have an asterisk by because it doesn't actually exist yet. But if you think about an API that understands resources, that understands state management for resources, but which can act locally or can act remotely as kind of a first-class citizen in that world. That's what I mean by remote RAL. And David Ludercourt and others have been doing a lot of thinking around how to actually implement this. I think we'll see that come up first in the discovery product that we talked about this morning, where there's a real need for manipulating and understanding the state of resources like cloud service APIs in a way that doesn't involve the kinds of things that you have to do today in Puppet, where to use the AWS module, for instance, it has a great set of models for different kinds of AWS resources, but you have to pretend to apply them onto a node. And that node happens to have AWS credentials that can go out and check them. And we've got to sort of eliminate that level of indirection and make it so that you can have a RAL that can behave remotely. And then on the far end for state-based management is obviously what we have today of traditional Puppet. And agents aren't going anywhere. One of the comments from a customer that I talked to when we were first talking about tasks was he broke out an imaginary cowbell and started singing "Don't Fear the Reaper." But it was "Don't fear the agent," is what he was saying. Like, don't be afraid of the fact that you have an agent everywhere. It's really awesome. It's really powerful. And don't necessarily feel like you have to jettison that in order to in order to keep going with future developments. So that's where that's headed. The next important point is we got to become more cloud native. And I mean a couple of things by this. Does anyone recognize this screenshot? It's from the first season of True Detective, when Cole was trying to track down the killer and ended up with what's called on TV tropes as string theory, where you have this giant wall filled with all the connections and all the crazy things. This, to me, is what tracking down problems in SSL and Puppet's SSL layer is like sometimes. If you have at least we fixed that one error message that says hostname was not matched with certificate, but it's still not obvious. It's not intuitive, and the amount of overhead that you have to go through to manage a certificate for a device that's only going to be up for a few minutes is just not. It's the wrong thing to do. So we've got to do some work to figure out how to make SSL a lot easier, to make it more cloud native, so that systems can come up, they can go down. We have a strong association between the node's identity and the classification and the data that it ought to receive that doesn't involve going through a X509 PKI. Again, we've made big steps in this direction with the policy-based auto-signing, but we've got to take it further. The other big area here for me for cloud-native stuff is around secret storage. Right now, you can do this sort of piecemeal, but we've got to come up with some really first-class ways to keep secrets in something like HashiCorp's Vault or Conjure, CyberArk, or any of the other 5 or 6 projects that are also called Vault. And retrieve them securely and apply them to the node without requiring you to do a lot of work. And again, there's some foundational stuff here with the sensitive data type and some other stuff that we've done recently, but it's not holistic in the way that it needs to be in order to really work for those systems where you don't want to have the idea that they should just be allowed to get the data that might change frequently. This could be a console key. It could be something that's a database access key that might rotate very frequently. We've got to be able to deal with that short-lived configuration data in a much more native way. And finally, and this is a point that I will continue to stress until everyone else is no longer stressed about it, backwards compatibility is super important. And specifically of the language, this is Alan Turing. He was an absolute genius who committed suicide at age 42 in a really tragic case of what happens when bigotry becomes institutionalized. It was illegal at the time that he lived to be homosexual in the United Kingdom, and so he was forced to undergo chemical castration and killed himself as a consequence of that. I mean to leave on such a downer, but that's just a brutal consequence, and we're seeing some of those echoes in our world today that is very personally distressing to me. Famously, he came up with the idea of the universal Turing machine, and to show that something is Turing complete, it's just enough to show that it can be used to simulate another Turing complete system. And my point here is that I feel like we've reached this point with the Puppet language, and we do not need to do any more work on the public language, and in particular, no more backwards incompatible work on the public language. And so my commitment is that as we continue to evolve Puppet to manage new things and to work in new ways, that we're going to, as deeply as possible and as strong as possible, ensure that the code that you've written today will continue to run in the way that you expect tomorrow. And that's all I have. Thank you very much. I'm Apuk, so you can hit at me at Twitter. Thanks very much.